My wife said you need to ask him to say, "Okay, let's see it," and also to tell you what the fit for the day is. And I feel like that is important. So
Well, today it's actually, I don't know how well you can see it. It has been Hotel, um,
excellent.
a cartoon. And yeah, as for the tagline, all right, let's see it.
Love it. Is it weird that people ask you to do that? Because I'm sure I'm not the first
It does
person.
get a little weird sometimes. Like I'll go to give a lecture or something, and the people will be like, "We want you to say the line." And it's like, but I'm the one giving the lecture. Why would I? I don't. It doesn't make sense.
Hey, welcome to Beer Christianity. My name's Jonty, and with us we have Dan McClellan. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Jonty. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. Not too bad. And yourself?
Doing well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on the show. If you do not know who Dan is, he is one of my favorite TikTokers. I think he's one of a lot of people's favorite TikTokers. He's an academic. He's a huge kind of voice, I think, in the world of biblical and religious literacy. And yeah, you also have your own podcast called Data Over Dogma.
Mhm.
Um, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I wanted to start off by asking you to tell us a little bit about the the academic kind of background that you come from, and yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I actually fell in love with studying the Bible and its background and language and history when I was serving as a proselytizing missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Uruguay from 2002 to the end of 2000 or the beginning of 2004. And I I found a Bible dictionary that was in Spanish, but it had a chart with the Proto-Semitic script and the ancient Hebrew script and Greek and Latin and all this, and then modern equivalents. And I realized if I had a Hebrew text, I could at least replicate closely what the sounds were. And I didn't know what that was at the time, but I could figure out how to transliterate Hebrew. And it became this fascinating puzzle to me. And I just thought there's so much to the history, the culture, the language, the literature, everything about the Bible that I wanted to know. I thought, wow, if I could make a living studying the Bible, that would be about the coolest thing in the world. And so when I got back home from Uruguay, I went to Brigham Young University here in Provo, Utah, and I did an undergraduate in what they call Ancient Near Eastern Studies. And I emphasized biblical Hebrew and did a minor in classical Greek. Then I went away to Oxford, your neck of the woods, and I did a master's degree in Jewish studies there. I wrote a thesis on anti-anthropomorphism and the Septuagint translation of Exodus 24:10. Then I went and did another master's degree at a university called Trinity Western University in Canada, where I wrote my thesis there on the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible through the lens of cognitive linguistics, and then did my doctoral work through Exeter University back in the UK under my supervisor, Dr. Francesca Stavrokopoulou, and wrote my doctoral dissertation on conceptualization of divine images and divine agency through the lenses of cognitive linguistics as well as the cognitive science of religion. So a lot of what I focus on is conceptualizations of deity, of scripture, and of religious identity through a variety of different methodological lenses.
So that's a hugely kind of rigorous academic background, and then you thought, you know what, TikTok is really going to be into this, so I'm going to go on there. How did that
Well,
happen?
I actually thought TikTok would not be interested in that kind of thing. I just thought TikTok was for Korean teenagers to interrupt the presidential campaigns of Republicans, and I was fine to leave it to them. And then I started seeing videos from TikTok being posted on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that were talking about the Bible and religion. And I was like, who is in charge over there? And so I started lurking on TikTok, checking out the kinds of content that were being produced. And I realized there was an awful lot of content that was overlapping with my academic wheelhouse, but I didn't really see any credentialed experts there. I saw some theologians who were waxing theological about stuff, but I didn't see critical scholars, and that was something that I thought was needed. So I saw a gap that this was right in the middle of the pandemic. I was like, well, I got nothing else to do. So why don't I start recording videos of myself and making myself very uncomfortable? So it was a lot of work to hit record that first time I decided to record a video, and I have gotten used to it. I would not say that I'm comfortable with it or that it's more natural, but I kind of gotten used to it. But yeah, I was surprised by how many people appreciated my approach, because I tried to position myself as not batting for either team, but as kind of calling balls and strikes, being a bit of an umpire or a referee. And I realized that's not going to tickle a lot of people's fancy when it comes to more controversial issues. But to my surprise and my delight, there are an awful lot of people who are looking for exactly that kind of approach to things like the Bible and religion. And so it's been surprising how much interest and support there is out there. And it has actually facilitated a change in careers, where I was working for just over a decade as a scripture translation supervisor for the LDS Church, and left that work almost 2 years ago to do content creation full time. And so I tell people I'm unemployed, but I make my living combating the spread of misinformation about the academic study of the Bible and religion online, and I could not be happier.
So you weren't the person who wanted to be front and center and, making videos all the time and that guy before this?
No, I was happy to argue with people on Twitter.
Aren't we all?
Because they didn't have to. Nobody had to see my face or hear my voice or anything. Least of all me. But then. Yeah, it was very unusual. And at first I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Everybody else seems to know what they're doing. And there was a steep learning curve, but I saw people who were making very, very high quality videos. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that. And I discovered that as long as I could reach a pretty low bar, minimum production quality, as long as the content was there, nobody really cared. And I was like, well, I can do that. So there are a lot of ways my videos could be better produced, and there are a lot of ways that I could take care of my this product a lot more carefully. But I've decided I'm gonna commit that time and effort to other things.
Well, it seems to be working for you, because you've got a huge number of followers now, and just such a kind of high profile. I think a lot of people came to you. Well, I did anyway, through your kind of debunking misinformation. These absolutely ridiculous videos that everyone's relative at some point is going to post on Facebook about the Bible predicted whatever. There's going to be some terrible AI images, and they're going to tell you that skeletons have started dancing in Jordan. And, was that where you started, or did you start with something else? And which was the first kind of series of those that you got into?
Yeah, that was where I started. I think my two primary goals are to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and to combat the spread of misinformation about the academic study of the Bible and religion. And initially, what like angered me enough to actually press record was a video about the Jordan-led codices, which were fake artifacts. They're hoaxes that were announced almost 15 years ago that were supposed to have come out of Jordan. And they're the earliest Christian documents and all this nonsense. And they're things that were being promulgated and promoted by a charlatan. And I had, for many years, I had worked with other scholars who, like me, wanted to ensure that the public wasn't getting taken for a ride when it came to this kind of stuff. And I had dealt with those Jordan-led codices back in 2011 when they first came out, trying to spread awareness that these are forgeries with the help of some colleagues. But it was on blogs, and we didn't have a ton of reach back then. There was only so much we could do between Facebook and our personal blogs, so we couldn't garner a ton of attention. But I've always been out there trying to combat misinformation. And so I would, like I said, I was lurking for a while. Then I saw this video trying to promote the lead codices, and I was like, damn it, I got to make a video now. And so the first video on my entire account is addressing the Jordan-led codices thing. And I just kind of hit the ground running from there.
And people, I imagine, have not always taken, I don't have to imagine, I've seen people responding to you, have not always taken well to it. Sometimes because you're disabusing them of some conspiracy theory, and sometimes I think because it's challenging something quite deeply held. How do you, who if you weren't seeking that kind of interaction or, you know, spotlight or that kind of stuff, how does that feel to be in that space where you're having that effect?
It is, I think I'm conflicted about it because it does bring a lot of negative attention my way, but at the same time, there's an awful lot of positive attention, and I see effects that I never could have anticipated. I get messages every day from folks who tell me that a given video or just my work in general is helping them to heal from past trauma related to a high demand religion. It's helping them repair relationships with family and friends and things like that. And I never could have anticipated that me arguing about whether or not angels were chained underneath the Euphrates River. I never thought that kind of stuff could actually accomplish something that meaningful in other people's lives. But as I've gotten deeper and deeper into this, and as more and more folks have shared with me how it's affecting them, I realize that this is, I feel like I've stumbled onto something much bigger than me, and I feel humbled and honored that I am my work is able to do this for certain people, but it also, I feel the weight of that responsibility as well. And so it's a mix of a bunch of different things. But stopping has never entered my imagination. At no point have I ever considered that. I think I've stumbled onto something that I think is going to can make a significant contribution to bettering a lot of people's lives around my country, around the world. And that's all I've ever wanted out of the work that I do is to make the world a better place. And so if arguing with people about the mark of the beast is the way to do that, then I'm happy to put this out in front of people, despite all of the mockery that is going to come my way as a result.
I mean, I love it. I find it so cool. I'm very comfortable when you're kind of debunking the conspiracy theories and the mark of the beast stuff, and then occasionally you'll put out something where I'll be like, "Oh shit, no, I don't want to hear that. I can't deal with this much cognitive dissonance in my faith. I need to just move on a little bit." Do you get a lot of that from people as well? Of like, look, I just can't listen to some videos. Like,
yeah, some. I don't hear it a ton. But what I get more frequently is there are a lot of folks who are like, yeah, I like most of what he does. And then they're like, until he starts talking about politics. And it's like, well, I've repeaded pointed out that the distinction between religion and politics is pretty artificial and is pretty historically recent. And I've talked about that at length related to my work on the conceptualization of religion and religious identity and the development of the concept of religion. And at the same time, I get a lot of, you have this liberal bias. Why do you always talk about right-wing authoritarianism? And so I hear more from people like that who are like, leave the politics out of it. I love your other stuff. Just stop talking about right-wing authoritarianism. And it's like, no, that's intimately connected with religious identity. And that's an actual sociological category that has a lot of correlates and a lot of data to back it up. If I don't talk about this, I'm not giving you the full picture. I'm just giving you fragments, and I'm not explaining what's going on. And so I think that's cognitive dissonance from folks who, rather than acknowledging what it is and, and if somebody says, I can't deal with that right now, great. I don't blame anybody for feeling that way. But folks who are like, now you're talking about politics, they're experiencing that cognitive dissonance, and then they're just finding a way to dismiss it. They're just coming up with some rhetorical deflection. Yeah. And then accusing me of being the one who's in the wrong. So, yeah, I hear from people who say, can't deal with the cognitive dissonance, and I have absolutely no problem with that. I'm not here to be like, no, you have to listen to me. But more commonly, I hear from folks who are like, why do you hate the right wing so much. And it's like, it's not that. It's that I'm actually trying to expose you to actual research about what is underlying a lot of these behaviors and these ideologies and these dogmas. And a lot of it is social dominance orientation, right-wing authoritarianism, and structuring power and values and boundaries to serve identity politics. And a lot of people aren't ready to hear that.
And I love that you use the term identity politics while talking about right-wing authoritarianism, because I think that term has been kind of weaponized against people on the left or on the liberal side of things. And identifying what the right is doing a lot of the time, particularly with white supremacy or with Christian nationalism as identity politics, I found really, really helpful. Do you get a lot of pushback on that kind of identification? Was that a surprise to a lot of people?
I think so. I think a lot of people, when they think of identity politics, they think of like Black Lives Matter, and they think of non-white, non-nativist, all these other kinds of identities, because they think of cis hetero white maleness as the default. And so they don't think of it as an identity that also has its own structure and framework and defenses and everything like that. And the reality is that everybody is mired in identity politics, including me, including everyone else. We have absolutely no other choice, because that's how our human minds are structured, how they have evolved. And so it's a part of all of our existence, our perception of ourselves, our perception of the world around us, and our place within it. And so when people are like, I don't think you're using identity politics right, and my response is usually, no, you just don't understand identity politics. And you saying, wait a minute, identity politics is something minorities do. That is identity politics, because you're trying to deflect from the demonstrable fact that everybody is engaged in identity politics. So I've had to make some videos where I explain exactly what I mean about identity politics and why I think it's relevant, and how I'm not claiming to be exempt from it. Like the best we can do is try to recognize its effects when they bubble to the surface, and then where they're problematic, do what we can to try to reverse them, to try to correct for them, to try to respond to them. And so, yeah, there's an awful lot of misunderstanding, and certainly there are people who are like, I don't think you're right about that. But those are folks who I think have only tried to understand the term to the degree that it can be subsumed within their worldview. And anything that challenges that worldview, they're gonna be like, no, not interested. Don't want to run up into that cognitive dissonance.
It's wild, because you've got people coming out as Christian nationalists, and yet people don't see the connection. Is that literally just because I haven't thought about it enough, or what do you think it is?
I think it's cognitive dissonance, and I think people will see what they want to see, and if it is something that challenges identities that are important to them and their worldview, they'll negotiate with it. They'll try to reinterpret it as something else. And these days, blaming the other side for hatred and misinformation and all that kind of stuff is pretty in vogue. And so that's all you've got to do. Unfortunately, that's fomenting an atmosphere where now we have people who are digging in their heels about, yes, Democrats are controlling the weather. Democrats are sending hurricanes to destroy Florida. And it's wild, asinine. And these are people who are in Congress. These are legislators. And so, I think overall things have gotten a lot worse on a general level, because with the democratization of information that the internet has facilitated, everybody has at their fingertips an awful lot of data. And that makes everybody feel like they can be experts. And a lot of them just can't even Google competently, which is why I came up with this other tagline, think critically, Google competently. And both of those things are severely lacking in a lot of the discourse that we see going on online. And it has just reached just laughable, like it would be comedic if it were not impacting and harming and ending actual human lives.
But on that, I think the what I found refreshing in your channel particularly has been the fact that you're not afraid to say expertise exists. We're not all opinions are equally valid on subjects that require knowledge, which I think has been for a long time quite unfashionable to say. And it's just nice to hear. But have you got pushback, from unexpected places on that?
A little bit, yeah. There is some perception of elitism behind things like that. So in a recent video, I think I called out an apologist who was trying to correct my representation of the consensus view, and I was like, "Hey, this is not the scholarship going on. This is me, an expert, someone who engages in the scholarship, letting you know what's going on in the scholarship." And I got some comments from people who were like, whoa, back it up a little bit, buddy. That's elitism. And I was like, I'm responding to not only an argument but an accusation. And I don't think it's inappropriate to point that out. And I've tried to point it out repeatedly that this is not where the scholarship happens. My public scholarship is me reporting on what's going on in the academy. And then I invite people, hey, if you think your argument's better than the consensus view, and overwhelmingly I try to represent the consensus, whether or not I'm involved in it, whether or not I even agree with it. And a lot of people are like, well, consensus doesn't mean right. And saying, I didn't say it's right. I said, this is what convinces the majority of scholars, given the data that are available to us today. And if you want to understand the most likely conclusion, I think that's the best way to go at it, because the public doesn't have the skills, the resources, the capacity, or sometimes even the interest to go and interrogate every single corner of a given argument. And so when I tell people you don't have the capacity to engage the linguistic argument here, when it comes to what's going on in the Hebrew, I think they get offended because of that expectation that we're all on the same playing field now because we have access to the internet. Yeah. And that's simply not true. And I hope that people don't think I am insulting them, because there are an awful lot of people who could say the exact same thing about me regarding an awful lot of stuff. I share what I perceive to be the consensus view of doctors in the medical field all the time, particularly during COVID. But, I'm not the one who's going to defend that. I'm just trying to say these people who know better than both of us all agree that this is how things are. And so if somebody wants to say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, let the expert speak, I will back right down, because I recognize I'm not an expert. And I don't think there's anything that anybody needs to be shamed about, humiliated about, embarrassed about for not being an expert in a given field. Nobody is an expert in the majority of fields. We all, those of us who have the expertise in particular fields, are only carving out a tiny little bit of existence to say, I know more than most other people about this. So, yeah, I get that a bit. I can understand it to some degree, but at the same time, it's kind of part of what I'm trying to do here, is to say there are experts. Yeah. And their opinions are important. And so I'm going to report on what the expert opinions are. And I'm going to defend those against folks who come up and say, well, all the experts are dumb, or all the experts are biased, or none of the experts know what I know about this thing. So, and yeah, sometimes that comes across as a bit condescending. But of all the things I've been accused of being, condescending is one where I don't have a ton of room to argue against. Or at least let's say arrogant. I've been called arrogant a lot, and it's like, I wish I could argue, but when it comes to this topic that I've dedicated my entire life to, I'll give you arrogant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting, because it's kind of like when people say, I believe the science, I just follow the science. Most of us who say that, what I'm saying really is, look, I think these guys are authorities. I'm listening to the authority. It is to an extent an appeal to authority, and it's just different people choosing the authorities. What is it? So you reckon consensus is the best place to go to find that authority, but also most academia is about challenging the consensus view, at least in a small area?
Yeah. so biblical scholarship is rarely going to engage in issue where we can demonstrate something conclusively beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
We don't come up with laws of reading the Bible. Really, what we just have are collections of judgment calls and determinations about probability.
Yeah.
And so because we are imperfect instruments and we're just weighing probabilities, it's a moving target. It's like trying to nail an egg to a wall. It's not something that we can get a firm grip on much of the time. And so what my argument is that if you don't have the capacity to go and look at the original manuscripts and come up with an idea of what the original reading probably was and the circumstances of the author and who they were writing to and what they were hoping to accomplish, and so why they used the paronomastic infinitive in this particular construction and not in this other. If you can't interrogate all that, then I'm just saying, hey, the best minds on this question right now are in agreement that it means this. And I'm just saying that has the best likelihood of being true based on the available data. Could change tomorrow. A better argument could come up tomorrow that changes everybody's mind. And suddenly we all think differently. But in a world where we're just trying to weigh probabilities, I think that's the best way to go about it, unless you have the education and the skills and the resources to be able to drill down to the bedrock of an argument and say, I personally think this makes more sense. And for folks who do that, and scholars, that's largely what they're trying to do. I've done that in every single one of my publications. I'm trying to say, hey, I've drilled down to the bottom of this. I think this argument makes more sense, and I'm trying to influence the consensus view, just like pretty much all scholars are. And so it's kind of an amorphous thing that's growing and changing all the time based on the available data. And it's not, it would be nice if it came down to, here, let's rub this paper on this passage and it turned pink. That means we have inerrancy or something like that. It would be nice if it came down to that, and then we wouldn't have to use the weight of consensus. But that's just not the kind of field we're in. It's not the kind of research that we do.
So what do you think, in the way most people approach the Bible? Most people is obviously a very loaded term, but what do you think is the biggest mistake that people make when they come to the Bible?
The one that I harp on the most is the presupposition of univocality, which is something that is not only presupposed by pretty much everybody who accepts things like inerrancy and inspiration, but is even adopted for the sake of argument by a lot of critics of the Bible. And I think it's so widespread that they even think about it in those terms, unless they're consciously aware of univocality as a thing. And that's what I'm trying to do is raise awareness of the fact that there's no reason to think every last passage of the Bible agrees with every other passage. And so if I'm trying to figure out what this passage in John means, and you say, well, what about Genesis? Nothing about Genesis. Genesis is entirely irrelevant. Unless we can show that the author of John was actually adopting something from Genesis, which is a complex thing to show. And so that's probably the thing that I think is most widespread, that is most distorting when we approach the Bible, because people want to treat it as a jigsaw puzzle and it all fits together, and every piece is oriented in the same direction toward the same perspective and the same ideas. And the data just flatly preclude that dogma. And so I want people to be aware of that dogma and how pervasive it is.
And for people who've never encountered the term before, when we're talking about univocality, it's saying the Bible speaks with one voice, even though it's going through multiple authors or literary styles or that kind of thing. And
you see it all over the place. And so recently I made a video pointing out that when God tells Adam in Genesis 2:17, on the day you eat of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will certainly die. And I point out, hey, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
People will say, well, a day is like 1,000 years. I was like, where are you getting that from? You got to go to Psalms 90, or you got to go to 2 Peter 3 or something like that to get this little rhetorical flourish. And then you basically got to use that as an interpretive lens for renegotiating what's going on in Genesis 2:17. And so what you're doing is presupposing that whatever Psalms 90 is saying agrees with Genesis 2, and whatever Genesis 2 is saying agrees with Psalms 90. And so it's very subtle how commonly, or it's very subtle how univocality works. But yeah, it's the idea that every last verse of the Bible has to be speaking with one single unified and consistent voice and from one single unified and consistent perspective. And that's kind of an outgrowth of the dogma of inspiration, that every last verse of the Bible is inspired by God and therefore comes from a single source and therefore must speak with a single voice.
Yeah. And you similarly, I think, point out the fact that in Genesis you have multiple accounts of several events that happen just in that book. And when people encounter that and go, oh yeah, no, it can't all be true because they flat out contradict each other, even from the same source, or not from the same sources in the same books. How should we react? How should we deal with that? How should we react to that? Like, because does that mean, oh, this is all bullshit, like you need not read it? Do you know what I mean? Because like I think that's a way a lot of people will see it.
Yeah. Oh, and I get comments like that all the time. Oh, so we should just throw it all out. It's all garbage. And there are a ton of people who have for many centuries who have lived their entire lives as believing Christians who have not treated the Bible as inerrant, as inspired, as univocal, or they have treated it as inspired. There are folks who suggest that inspiration may be an impetus. It doesn't necessarily mean that it characterizes the output on the other side. So there are a lot of different ways that people rationalize these things. But I think it does mean that you need to think a little bit more critically about how you're coming up with the conclusions that you're arriving at regarding the Bible. And there's somebody I saw on Twitter, I forget who it was, but somebody commented that way back in 1953 or 58, C.S. Lewis published a book, Reflections on the Psalms or something like that. And one of the things that C.S. Lewis, who is, I don't know if you've been paying attention to social media, but C.S. Lewis gets brought up a lot by apologists who are trying to, and particularly
he's a saint for evangelicals. That's,
Yeah. But he comments that the Psalms are full of contradiction and error and even wicked. And specifically talking about the imprecatory Psalms, blessed is he who smashes your baby's heads against the rocks and so on. And nobody really cared back in the 50s because this idea of inerrancy, that no, every last bit of it is inspired and true and good, hadn't become a central identity marker. And then, so to infuriate a lot of people who don't like that I bring this up, these things ebb and flow in their importance depending on their service to the structuring of power and values and boundaries in the service of overwhelmingly right-wing authoritarian identity politics. And so inerrancy today is much more central as an identity marker. And so that's a line you have to toe. But C.S. Lewis, this person that a lot of evangelicals appeal to in defense of the rationality of their belief, rejected that, said, nope, it's wrong. It's got error. There are even Psalms that are wicked. And so, it's identity politics all the way down is a something that I'm fond of saying that a lot of people really don't like that I say. But yeah, the idea of inspiration, of univocality, of inerrancy, all those things are tied up in that, and they're ways to make the Bible more operational as an identity marker, as a tool of structuring power. They're not things that flow downstream from a critical and an informed interrogation of the Bible. They serve the interests of structuring power, and that's one of the main reasons that I want to keep that front and center as what I'm critiquing when I talk about the Bible. Yeah.
Do you think there is anything that unites the books that we generally know as the Bible, other than the kind of their history? Conceptually, is there a spiritual thread? Is there because you talk quite a lot about concepts of deity and the identity of God, and how different authors have probably been thinking of God. Is there anything that kind of runs through?
I think there's a concern. There are a lot of different things that characterize the different genres and the different authors and the different places and languages and contexts and everything. But I think if there's anything that is mostly consistent, I would say it's a desire to understand the writer's identity in relation to God. Now, that's not true everywhere. Like the Book of Esther, for instance, never mentions God.
Yeah.
But it is about identity as a Jewish community. And that community can be argued to exist only in relation to God. And so I think the relationship to community and to God is something that is, if not at the surface, is at least lurking just under the surface of most everything. And a lot of it is about again, boundaries and identity politics. It's responding to pressure or violence from outside our community. It's responding to how the boundaries of our community have been significantly expanded once we get into the New Testament. And it's like, oh, the gospel is for all the Gentiles now. Suddenly, the walls have been obliterated, and now we've got to consider a much larger scope and how we navigate between who's in and who's out. So I think the idea of community, as well as belonging and not belonging, who's in, who's out, and the relationship with God, I think is something that's at least lurking behind all of the scriptures. And then the other thing I'll say is that I frequently say that if you want to extract any kind of consistent principle from the Bible, you have to negotiate with it, because there's not really much of anything that's consistent. But one thing I've frequently said is I see two things that are consistent from beginning to end that don't seem to be problematized, questioned, doubted at all. One is the normativity of slavery, and the other is the treatment of women as commodities and the transactional nature of marriage. And so that's not a theological kind of through line throughout the entire Bible, but those are the two things that I think are probably most consistently represented throughout the Bible, which is not exactly the question you asked, but I think is an interesting observation about what does seem to be univocal throughout the Bible.
And that's the kind of thing that I think will make both sides of the political aisle angry. which then I can see you smiling when you say it, because you seem to know, like, oh, this is going to piss everyone off.
Oh, yeah. And I'll make a video where I say, oh, the Bible endorses slavery throughout. And people are like, so you're endorsing slavery? It's like, I don't know how many of my videos you've seen, but it's not enough. Because very clearly, I am not arguing that if the Bible says it's true.
Yeah.
But I still get that misunderstanding all the time, and I get messages from people like, maybe you should be more endorsing something just because you are arguing that it is what is in the Bible. But I've got a trade book coming out in April of next year called "The Bible Says So," where I'm going to be talking an awful lot about what people think the Bible says versus what the Bible actually seems to be saying. And I have made sure to be quite explicit. Just because the Bible says it doesn't mean it's good or right. And there are a bunch of places where I'm going to say, this is not just wrong. This is immoral. This is bad. This is evil. And it's in the Bible. And I'm going to point out that I think it is, in the long run, it's better to acknowledge and reject these things rather than try to renegotiate them into something that is good. Or do what an awful lot of pastors these days are doing, which is just lean into suggesting these things are good.
Insane.
Which is problematic.
More than a little. You talk quite a lot about that, negotiating with the text and the necessity of negotiating with the text if we're going to make it say any kind of consistent thing or really take anything from it. Are there principles that are helpful to employ when you negotiate with the text? Because obviously you can negotiate with the text in a lot of different ways, and some of them feel more and less honest, and some of them feel more and less helpful to the world or consistent with the spirit of the person of Jesus I see in one of the Gospels, or that kind of thing?
I think there's probably a spectrum that pretty much everybody who's negotiating with the text, who wants to leverage the text as some kind of authority, is going to fall somewhere on this spectrum. And on one end is the folks who want the text to function as a tool of authority, to structure power, to structure values, to structure boundaries in the service of advancing their own interests or the interests of their group or whatever. So those are the folks who I suggest are on the bad end of the spectrum, because that most commonly results in harm to other folks. Things that are causing harm, that's where I have issue with people's negotiations. And a lot of people will come at me and say, well, you're negotiating with it too, and you think that's bad. And no, I don't think it's bad. It's inevitable. But I think we need to be conscientious of why we're doing it. And there are folks who are doing it to structure power and to elevate their own access to power and resources, which almost always means somebody else gets left behind. Somebody else is getting shoved down. Somebody else is getting pushed out. And when that is minoritized, marginalized, or oppressed groups, I'm going to object to that. On the other end of things, I think there are people who negotiate with the text in order to better themselves, in order to try to improve the world around them, in order to understand a different way to navigate their lives and their relationships with the people around them in a way that makes them better people and that improves everyone else's lives. And so I think you've got a spectrum, and people are on different parts of that spectrum. One, I think, is more productive. The other, I think, is more destructive. And usually it comes down to whose interests are being prioritized. If I'm prioritizing my interests over and against the interests of minoritized, marginalized, oppressed people or groups, I'm going to say you're on the bad end of the spectrum. If I'm prioritizing the interests of as many people as I can fit into the group, if I'm prioritizing others' interests over my own, if I'm prioritizing the interests of minoritized, marginalized, or oppressed groups, I'm going to say that's closer to the good end of the spectrum. So in that negotiation, those are the considerations I hope people will take seriously, and I hope they will interrogate their own approaches to try to figure out which side of that spectrum they're on.
Fantastic. Your background is in the LDS. I see a lot of people hassling you about that. People who come from, evangelical Protestant or Catholic. Well, I think it's the Protestants who do it the most. How annoying is that? And do you get any pushback from within the LDS as well?
It is incredibly annoying because I've repeatedly and consistently said that's not what I'm here to do. Yeah. This is irrelevant. My scholarship is not influenced by my membership in this church, as hard as that may be for people to believe. I have repeatedly demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that my scholarship is not under the thumb of Latter-day Saint ideology. So that it gets frustrating having to deal with that literally every single day. Yeah. And I get pushback from within the church. But one thing, but it's overwhelmingly on Twitter. Like weird. I worked in the church office building for 2 years. Yeah, 2 years while I was making content on social media, and didn't experience any detrimental effects. Nobody came to me and told me that my job was under threat.
But is it because Jeremy from Accounts is sitting there on Twitter going like, Dan, I hate you?
Well, the only time anything ever worked its way inside my employment was because there were some videos one time that annoyed a lot of people who decided they were going to call my employer and try to get me in trouble. And my employer said, don't think you're doing anything wrong. So carry on. And what's funny is when it is people on Twitter, I can always count on the fact that if I went to their account and checked out their feed, I knew who they were voting for, and I knew what sides of a bunch of social issues they were taking. And so the opposition that I experience from within the LDS Church is overwhelmingly politically coded. It is overwhelmingly, he's a leftist and he's a liberal and he's destroying Mormonism from within. So like when it comes to just the scholarship and even from an ecclesiastical theological point of view, I don't get any flack at all. It is only from folks who think I'm a dirty, dirty leftist that I experience any flack.
And the evangelicals who think that you're a dirty Mormon, and
Well,
right.
yeah, and usually that's because I'm a leftist too. But yeah,
That's also true, actually.
Yeah, but there is heretic and leftist. There's an awful lot of overlap there. But yeah, there are definitely some folks who are on the more progressive side who will get on my case. However, it's usually about social issues. Like there was one guy who I don't know if he was like Orthodox or Catholic or what, but he's like a crusader against abortion.
Okay.
And was really upset with my presentation of what the Bible seems to be saying about fetal personhood.
Which is, by the way, incredibly helpful, I thought. Yeah,
I think it really clarifies things to understand the history of this argument and to see how people are trying to manipulate the terms of the argument today so that it's more manageable for them. But I was like, explaining where this is coming from, and he was like thumping his chest saying, no, I'm a progressive on everything else. And it's like, great. I'm sure we actually agree on a lot of other stuff. But this thing right here that you're talking about is an identity marker for conservatism, and you're carrying water for it. Whether you, the rest of your political repertoire is progressive or conservative, you're making an argument that was constructed within right-wing authoritarianism. And so, and all the arguments are a part of that. Like you're adopting arguments from that movement and you're making it, as the kids are saying, you're making it your whole identity.
Yeah.
And so even folks who would identify as progressive, when they come at me, it's overwhelmingly about the things on which they take a more conservative stance.
Fascinating.
So it's odd, isn't it, that that even the folks who want to come at me about theological arguments seem to be overwhelmingly influenced and guided by more political arguments as well, even as they get on my case about getting into the political.
Because people are going to be fascinated, can you quickly outline the biblical personhood in those kind of in the text that people tend to quote around abortion?
Yeah, so the Bible says absolutely nothing about abortion. In the Hebrew Bible, though, we do have perspectives that I think are relevant to the contemporary debate. And a lot of people today want to make it about when human life begins. But up until the 19th century, it was about when personhood began. And when we look in the Hebrew Bible, a fetus does not have personhood. A fetus is not treated as a person. It's treated overwhelmingly as a piece of property. And we see this most clearly in Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25, where we have this legislation about what happens if two men who are fighting accidentally injure a pregnant woman. And there are two outcomes that are addressed. The first outcome is that it causes the woman to miscarry, in which case the husband chooses a fine to impose on the perpetrator. And that fine is mediated by judges so that it's not exorbitant. The other outcome is that this causes permanent injury or death to the woman. In that case, talionic justice is activated. Talionic justice is retributive justice. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, burn for burn, life for life. And so that is a marker of the perception of full legal and moral personhood. If the text says, "Oh, you took that life, we're taking your life," that means that person was a person, and that's considered murder. Ending accidentally the life of the fetus does not result in talionic justice at all. In fact, there's not even a socially conventionalized, standardized value placed on the fetus. As if you injure or kill someone else's enslaved person, standardized value, 30 shekels across the board, because that is the value of that individual who still is kind of occupying that space between person and property. But to society, they've decided this is worth 30 shekels. The fetus, no, it's up to the husband to determine. And so what this shows is that the fetus is not a person. The fetus was conceptualized more as property, and specifically the property of the husband, not even the property of the mother. And then when we get into and elsewhere, life is conceptualized, personhood is conceptualized as constituted by breath. And so people say, "Oh, well, it says the life of the life of the person is in the blood. It's like, well, that's a misreading and also incomplete, because Leviticus 19 only talks about the life of being in the blood when it's talking about why you're not allowed to eat animal blood. So it's entirely about non-human blood, and it's entirely about why you shouldn't eat it. But also the word that is translated life is breath.
Interesting.
If you look in the Hebrew, it is the nephesh, which literally means breath, neck, or soul. And it is used as a synonym for life. And everywhere throughout the Bible, breath is fundamentally constitutive of life. And you see this in the early rabbinic literature as well, where they talk about the life not beginning until either the head or the majority of the body, if born in breach, has departed from the birth canal. Up to that point, the fetus is considered part of the mother's, the word is thigh, but this is probably a euphemism for genitals. And between 0 and 40 days of gestation, it's just considered water. And so, and the halakhic literature explicitly says, up until the point where the head or the majority of the body leaves the birth canal, that life can be sacrificed if it's necessary to save the life of the mother. But once it has left, it cannot be, because now it is a life and you cannot exchange life for life. So it's pretty explicit about that. Within early Christianity, they're much more influenced by Greco-Roman philosophical conventions and social conventions. And there were debates about where personhood began based on the concept of ensoulment, when the soul entered the body. And you had Pythagorean and Epicurean notions that it entered the body at conception. So personhood begins at conception. The Aristotelian idea was that it enters the body at 40 days for male fetuses, 90 days for female fetuses, because according to them, women were basically just underdeveloped men. And so this could be associated with the quickening, when a mother can discern the independent movements of the fetus after the fetus was fully developed. And then you had the Stoic position, was that the soul enters the body upon contact with the outside air. So it is at birth. Early Christians seem to be leaning more in the direction of the Pythagorean Epicurean notion until Augustine, who said, nope, it happens at the quickening. So the Aristotelian notion becomes the consensus view with Augustine all the way up until the middle of the 19th century. And so explicitly, the Christian idea was abortion is bad all the time. It's not murder until the quickening, when the soul has entered the body. And so when people talk about this debate today within religious contexts, I think they need to take into consideration the entire history of that and not just try to retreat to the simple notion of, oh, life begins, therefore it's murder. The overwhelming majority of Christian history flatly rejects that argument. And so if the Bible is sufficient, if the Bible is sola scriptura, is the case, then that argument is phenomenally problematized, because the Bible has, one, no single consistent position, and two, the positions it does hold aren't really helpful to the contemporary argument against abortion rights.
I don't know how you talk about the quickening without bringing up Highlander, by the way. I just think it's very impressive. I've taken up a lot of your time. I wanted to ask you, you do not talk about any kind of personal faith or your own kind of position on that. What's behind that?
Mainly, it's that I've been arguing about religion on the internet for 20 years plus, and I know how arguments go, and I'm not interested in wasting my time and everyone else's time, because if I start talking about that, that's all that I'm ever going to be able to talk about, and it will entirely distract, because suddenly that's going to give people in their imaginations an in to trying to undermine my scholarly positions, and not because my religious beliefs do or do not actually undermine my scholarly positions. They're just irrelevant to them. And so that was a clear and sharp boundary I set up at the very beginning with my content. I'm not here to talk about that. That's irrelevant. If you don't believe me, great. I couldn't care less. It's irrelevant, and I want to focus on the scholarship and the data and combating misinformation. And I don't believe I can do that if I am open to talking about all these other things. that are not relevant. So yeah.
I've always wanted to ask somebody who would know, what's a good translation of the Bible to read in English?
Depends on what you're wanting to get out of it, because translations are usually executed with a specific target audience in mind and a specific target function. And so the one that most closely aligns with what you're trying to get out of a Bible is going to result in the best reading. So, there are translations that are oriented toward missionary purposes. There are translations that are oriented towards serving, institutional goals and things like that. There are translations that are oriented towards prestige concerns. Like, I want to show off how clever I can be at translating, and I want to show off my prose, and I want to make something that people who already can access the source text will be like, he was so close to what it said, and it was so creative. And none of those are going to be of use to somebody who's like, I just want to understand what the original authors were trying to say. And so if the goal is to try to understand what the original authors are trying to say, I think you have to strike a balance between accessibility and faithfulness. And right now, I would say, if you're looking for a Bible that has the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament together, the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version is probably the one that does the best at generally striking that balance. It's absolutely not perfect, and there are aspects of it that I criticize, including in the book that I have coming out. If you're looking for just a Hebrew Bible, I think Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible is phenomenal and has a lot of wonderful notes as well. Also not perfect, and I have criticized aspects of that translation as well. The Jewish Publication Society's Tanakh, I think, is decent. I think it's very good, and the Torah commentary series that they have is phenomenal as well. But that translation actually tries to stick strictly to the Masoretic text, and so they minimize the degree to which they're willing to go to the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls to try to correct a reading that's not clear or a reading that's clearly wrong. And so I think that's kind of undercuts that a little bit. For the New Testament, there have been a couple of translations of just the New Testament by individuals recently. David Bentley Hart published one a little bit ago, but it's very idiosyncratic. The goal was to try to reproduce the experience for the English reader that would have been experienced by the native Greek reader. Okay. So if it's flowery, polished Greek, then it's flowery, polished English. Where if it's like the Book of Revelation, where it's stilted and awkward Greek, then the English is stilted and awkward. So it makes for an interesting experience. But if somebody's wanting to try to experience what one gospel versus another, how they might have tasted different to their audience, then sure, that would be a great translation. Not a ton of notes. So it's idiosyncratic. It's a great translation for what it's trying to accomplish, but I usually wouldn't recommend it to folks who just want to understand better the New Testament. Sarah Rudin is a translator who published a translation of the Gospels. That is interesting. A very technical translation, uses transliterations for names and place names and uses diacritics and things like that. So that might throw some people off, but if you're comfortable with that, I think it's an interesting take on the Gospels. But yeah, I would recommend still just the NRSV UE for folks looking for both volumes together.
And if it's not too bitchy, which one do you wish people would stop reading?
The ESV.
Okay.
Yeah.
No hesitation. Just
it's a very popular one, but I would say it is also a fundamentally misogynist translation. Like, the purpose was to try to push back against the perceived liberalism of the NIV.
Good Lord.
Yeah. So that tells you how far gone they are.
Yeah.
So yeah, the ESV is terrible. And there are a bunch of reasons why I would criticize the NIV and the NASB and other translations as well. But the one that I groan about the most when I see people quoting it right now is the ESV.
Okay. Great. Good to know. Dan, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Where can people find more of your stuff?
So I'm on most of the main social media sites as @McClellan, as a phonetic spelling of my last name. It's MAKLELAN. I also have the Data Over Dogma podcast, which releases new episodes every Monday. And that's on YouTube and then wherever you can find your podcasts. And then, come April, I'm going to have a trade volume that will be in all the booksellers around the country called The Bible Says So. What we get right and wrong about Scripture's most controversial issues. So I'm very excited about that coming out. So
fantastic. We're going to have to talk to you again around that as well, if you have the time.
That would be awesome.
You may be too much of a big star by then. I mean, it's already amazing that you came to think so.
One of the things I need to do a better job of managing now that I'm doing this for a living is my schedule. The goal was to have a less packed schedule. And so this year I have not done great at that, but that's my priority for next year, is making sure that I don't get too swamped so that I have opportunities to do this kind of thing more often.
Fantastic. Dan, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, not to sound like the fangirl that I absolutely am, but is Dan not the coolest? He's so smart, he's so funny. So grateful to have him on the show. Do go check out his Data Over Dogma podcast. It is very, very good. Get his book. I know I'm going to. And find him on all the socials. Not always easy viewing, as I say, but genuinely brilliant. If you want to read a version of this, an edited version of this, if you're a nerd and you like reading, then you can get Shibboleth magazine. Shibboleth is a magazine not really of Beer Christianity, but a bunch of us who are part of the Beer Christianity crew work on it. It's a leftist Christian magazine. The issue that Dan is in has a theme about the Bible, lots of different takes on it, and also some stuff on Patrice Lumumba, Frantz Fanon, Desmond Tutu, a whole bunch of Christian resistance stuff. And it's a good magazine. You should check it out, shibbolethmag.com. You can also find out everything you need to know about Beer Christianity at beerchristianity.co.uk. Check us out, shibbolethmag.com, beerchristianity.co.uk. And if you want to write to us about this episode, you can write at beerchristianity@yahoo.com, because we old school. Thanks for listening.